Oh, hi there. I almost didn't see you. You know, I've been reminiscing about when I was back in high school. I had this teacher named Mr. Chalecki. He made us do this project very early on in the year. It was about the Civil War. Actually, no, it was more about what led up to the Civil War, the stuff that caused it. Now, I'll try to explain to you. Here goes.
The Northwest Ordinance was an act passed by Congress in 1787. Its primary effect was to create the Northwest Territory, which was the first organized territory of the United States. This helped lead to the Civil War due to the fact that people fought over whether the Northwest Territory would be slave or free. The Kentucky and Virginia resolutions were political statements drafted in 1798 and 1799 that claimed that states had the right to declare acts of Congress unconstitutional. Congress did not care about these statements, though, so it showed the South that the North didn't really care about states' rights, and it made the states start to get worried. This led to, obviously, the Civil War due to the fact that now states started fearing for their rights from the federal government. The Missouri Compromise was an act passed in 1820 between pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions in the United States. What it basically did was it created a line across the 36-degree latitude and 30-degree longitude throughout the United States, and claimed that any land above that line would be non-slave, and any land below that line would be slave. Now, this created peace for a while, for a couple of years, but this started leading to conflict due to the fact that now that the entire country is divided, which would eventually lead to more conflict in the Civil War. The Tariff of 1828 was a protective tariff passed by Congress, which was designed to protect industry in the North. This helped protect the industry in the North due to the fact that it started taxing imports from other countries, which would increase their prices and which would cause U.S. citizens to buy things manufactured in the United States. Now, this was very beneficial to the northern United States since more people were buying their goods, but the southern economy relied on these imports, cheap imports, for their economy. So the South was very angered, and they began claiming this tariff was a tariff of abominations, and it created tension between the North and the South. Nat Turner's Slave Rebellion was a slave rebellion that took place in August 1831 in Virginia. It was led by Nat Turner, and around 55 to 65 white people were killed. The rebellion didn't last that long, but the damage was done. This started creating a lot of tension between slaves and slave owners, which would obviously lead to the Civil War due to the fact that the war was fought over slavery. Prigg versus Pennsylvania was a Supreme Court case in which Edward Prigg fought for the right to be free due to the fact that he was able to escape to a free state. Now, the South looked to the court to resolve the issue of escaped slaves into the free states, but instead they undercut the Fugitive Slave Act and followed the Pennsylvania law which prevented blacks to be returned to slavery. This, in turn, overturned Edward Prigg's conviction. Now, this created distrust within the South and the national government because the South wanted the national government to help them, but instead the national government did not help them. The Texas annexation was a U.S. requirement of the state of Texas, which entered the Union as the 28th state. Now, this created conflict between the United States and Mexico over the fact that they were fighting over the borders along the Rio Grande. Now, this also contributed to the Civil War because it was not only below the Missouri Compromise line, but it was also above it. So people fought over whether Texas should be a slave state or a free state. The Mexican-American War was an armed conflict between Mexico and the United States. It was mainly a dispute over the fact that Mexico still considered Texas a part of their land, although the U.S. had already annexed them. The United States eventually won the war and acquired a bunch of territories north of Mexico. This would lead to a lot of conflict because people would argue over whether these territories would be slave or free states. The Wilmot Proviso was a proposed bill that would have banned slavery in all territories acquired through the Mexican-American War. Now, this created a public outcry from the South because they feared that if this bill had been passed, the slave states would have been outnumbered by the free states. It would have made the slave states feel as if they had less power in the government than the non-slave states. In 1854, the U.S. tried to annex Cuba from Spain through the Ostend Manifesto, and they claimed that they would declare war on Spain if they refused. When this became public, the North was angered at the South because the South risked going to war with Spain just so they could expand their slave empire. This created a ton of tension between the North and the South. Manifest destiny was the idea that God was on the side of American expansion. This belief led the U.S. to annex land all the way to the Pacific Ocean. These annexations eventually led to more conflict over whether these acquired states would be slave or free. The Underground Railroad was a network of secret routes and safe houses used by 19th century black slaves in the United States to escape to free states in Canada, with the aid of abolitionists and Northerners who were sympathetic to their cause. This led to conflict due to the fact that the South felt that the North was robbing them of their property, the slaves, and this led to a lot more tension between the North and the South over slavery. The Fugitive Slave Act was an act passed in 1850 which stated that all runaway slaves that were captured must be returned to their masters, regardless if they were in a free state or in a slave state. This angered abolitionists due to the fact that they felt that slaves should be free once they made it to free soil, and this made Southerners happy due to the fact that they were able to regain their quote-unquote stolen property. Now, this added to tension between abolitionists and pro-slavery people because they fought over whether this was a proper act or not. The Compromise of 1850 was a package of 5 bills, including the Fugitive Slave Act, passed in the United States in September 1850, which diffused a 4-year confrontation between the slave states of the South and the free states of the North regarding the status of territories acquired during the Mexican-American War. The Compromise of 1850 represented an attempt to solve the divisive slavery issue once and for all. The complex compromise included 5 interwoven bills. It began under the leadership of Henry Clay and opposed by President Taylor and passed under the leadership of Stephen Douglas and signed into law by President Fillmore. The act failed to end the slavery issue and instead helped usher in an era of unparalleled sectional strife. Uncle Tom's Cabin was a novel written by Harriet Beecher Stowe in 1852. The novel depicted all the horrors of slavery that took place in the South. The novel attracted a lot of attention from the North, and it showed all the devastating, horrible things that were occurring in the South through slavery. This angered the South because they didn't want people to discover the horrible things they were doing, and it added a lot of people into the abolitionist movement, which made them even more angry because now they had even more opposition to deal with. Bleeding Kansas was a series of violent political confrontations involving anti-slavery free staters and pro-slavery border ruffian elements that took place in the Kansas Territory and the neighboring towns of Missouri between 1854 and 1861. At the heart of the conflict was a question of whether Kansas would enter the Union as a free or slave state due to the fact that Kansas was popular sovereignty. As such, Bleeding Kansas led to a bunch of fights between the North and the South over getting power so they could create the state to be either slavery or non-slavery. In 1856, a South Carolina congressman, Preston Brooks, nearly killed Sumner on the Senate floor 2 days after Sumner delivered an intensely anti-slavery speech called The Crime Against Kansas. In the speech, Sumner characterized the attacker's cousin, South Carolina Senator Andrew Butler, as a pimp for slavery. This led to a lot of conflict due to the fact that it showed even more violence between anti-slavery and pro-slavery people. Dred Scott v. Sandford was a landmark decision by the U.S. Supreme Court in which the court held that African Americans, whether slave or free, could not be American citizens and therefore had no standing to sue the federal court, and that the federal government had no power to regulate slavery in the federal territories acquired after the creation of the United States. Now, the South was very happy to hear about this, but the North obviously was very displeased. They wanted slaves to have equal rights as everyone else, and they wanted them to be treated as second-class citizens. So this led to even more conflict between the North and the South. Hinton Harper was a Southern U.S. critic of slavery during the 1850s. In 1857, he published a book which he dedicated to the non-slaveholding whites of the South. The Impending Crisis of the South, written partly in North Carolina, but published when the author was in the North, argued that slavery hurt the economic prospects of non-slaveholders, and that it was an impediment to the growth of the entire region of the South. Now, this angered pro-slavery people a lot because it started creating a small abolitionist movement in the South. So now they had their own friends turning against them, and expanded the abolitionist movement even more, which created a lot of tension and anger in the South. The Battle of Harper's Ferry was fought September 12 through September 15, 1862, as part of the Maryland campaign of the American Civil War. As General Robert E. Lee's Confederate Army invaded Maryland, a portion of his army under Major General Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson surrounded, bombarded, and captured the Union garrison at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, a major victory at a relatively minor cost. Now this angered both the North and the South due to the fact that the North had lost men and lost people, but it also angered the South because they were raided by Northern people, and it created a lot of conflict. It was the first battle, and it was basically the main cause of the Civil War. The 1860 presidential election was the 19th quadrennial presidential election in the United States. It resulted with a victory for Abraham Lincoln, even though he had not a single vote in any of the southern states. This made southern states fear that they had no longer any power, and resulted in a lot of southern states seceding. The Confederate States of America, also known as the Confederate States or the Confederacy, was a government set up in February 1861 by cotton states of the Lower South. 7 states joined before the war began, and 4 of the Upper South were admitted afterwards. These states all seceded from the Union, and it created immense conflict between the North and the South, because now the South no longer considered themselves part of the United States. The Star of the West was a civilian steamship hired by the United States government to transport military supplies and reinforcements to the garrison of Fort Sumter. The Star of the West was fired upon by Confederates in an effort to dawn the Civil War. Star of the West was giving a warning shot across the bow and turned about to leave the harbor mouth. She was hit 3 times by what were effectively the first shots of the American Civil War. The Corwin Amendment is a proposed amendment to the United States Constitution passed by the 36th Congress, Second Session, on March 2, 1861, in the form of House Resolution Number 80. It would forbid subsequent attempts to amend the Constitution to empower the Congress to abolish or interfere with domestic institutions of the state, including persons held to labor or service, in reference to slavery. This proposed amendment is still pending before the state legislatures for ratification, because Congress submitted it to the state legislatures without a deadline, since the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery was adopted in 1865. The Battle of Fort Sumter was a bombardment and surrender of Fort Sumter near Charleston, South Carolina, that ignited the Civil War. On December 26, 1860, U.S. Major Robert Anderson surreptitiously moved his small command from the indefensible Fort Moultrie on Sullivan's Island to Fort Sumter. An attempt by U.S. President James Buchanan to reinforce and resupply Anderson using the unarmed merchant ship Star of the West failed when it was fired upon by the shore batteries on January 9, 1861. During the early months of 1861, the situation around Fort Sumter increasingly began to resemble a siege. The Union eventually lost Fort Sumter to the Confederates, and it resulted in Lincoln's immediate call for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion, resulted in an additional 4 southern slave states to also declare secession and join the Confederacy. This began the Civil War. Reconstruction was a period after the Civil War that expanded from roughly 1865 through 1877, following the Civil War, and involved the reintegration of states of the Confederacy. It was a highly volatile time because while many Northerners saw this as a chance to completely end slavery and have the South integrated back with the United States, many in the South saw this period as a further insult added to the injury of the loss of the Civil War.
And that, children, is how the Civil War started.